Thanks very much, Dominic, for this opportunity. So this video clip represents what's a metaphor for our present situation. We're basically sawing away, we're undermining our own foundations, and when bad things happen, they're going to happen very, very quickly. And when we fall through the floor, it'll be too late. We won't be able to do anything about it. So the key is to do things now. So I know you're all here basically to listen to Lara, but you're just going to have to put up with me as the warm-up act for the first half. So here goes. In this post-truth world, what can you believe in? I have a few guidelines myself, so I go according to what the evidence dictates and whether what is being promoted makes sense. Is it logical? Is it rational? What's the evidence behind it? And I don't think you should listen to any, you know what they say about opinions. Some opinions are actually better than others. So whoever's advocating one thing or another, my criteria would be, does that person have a track record of making accurate judgments in complicated situations using evidence and reason? What's the track record of getting things right? What is the ability to prognosticate in terms of future outcome? And what is the track record of shaping management plans to achieve favorable outcomes? So you've got to ask this yourself, but don't take anything at face value. You have to do your own research, double check, because there's a lot of disinformation out there. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what I do. This is my day job. And I'll just give you an example of a patient, Mr. P.S., who saw me about 5 years ago. So he was admitted over the weekend in Sunnybank, and he was feeling poorly with vague symptoms. He was found to have heart failure, lots of fluid in his lungs. The admitting weekend doctor gave him some Lasix to get rid of the fluid from his lungs. And he had a few sort of basic tests over the weekend, and he was handed over to me on Monday afternoon after some basic tests had been done, and I caught up with him that afternoon. And there were a number of problems with his heart. So he was in this rapid, irregular rhythm called atrial fibrillation. And he had heart failure with fluid in his lungs, still had some residual fluid in his lungs. The ultrasound of his heart showed that his heart function was very poor. Now, that's terrible because untreated, that has like the prognosis of metastatic lung cancer. But not only that, he had a very severe narrowing of this valve, the aortic valve, and that alone can kill people. 50% of people with severe aortic stenosis die within a couple of years. On top of that, his blood test had suggested that he had had a small heart attack. But he insisted to me that Monday afternoon he was feeling fine after that dose of Lasix. He peed some fluid out and he was feeling great. He wanted to go home. So I tried to explain to him the multiple problems that he was facing. He discharged himself against medical advice, but at least he was sensible enough to go to his GP for a second opinion. GP phoned me and I explained to the GP what's going on. The GP told him, get your ass back into hospital and get your heart fixed. So he came back under me. I transferred him to Greenslopes Hospital, where I performed his angiogram, which is a test where we inject dye down the arteries of the heart. And sure enough, as we expected, because he had evidence of heart attack and in previous heart attacks, he had severe triple vessel disease. So any of these things could have killed him at any moment, but it just shows that in some people, things creep up on them very, very slowly. The body compensates. They don't even feel it until one fine day there's a tipping point. If they're lucky, the tipping point doesn't kill them, so they come to hospital, they get some treatment, but the underlying causes have to be treated. So medication wasn't enough, obviously, for this patient. I referred him to the director of cardiology in Greenslopes, Chris Smith, who then, as an inpatient, because we couldn't let him go home, his problems were too severe. So basically, Chris fixed his heart. He did triple bypass surgery, replaced his aortic valve, and Chris rang me after the operation was over, which is a bit unusual because, you know, he does these bypass surgeries all the time. They go well, so I was wondering, why would Chris ring me? So he found something quite unusual. He found a huge clot in the left atrial appendage. And that's part and parcel of his abnormal rhythm called atrial fibrillation, but it's pretty uncommon to see something that severe. And he said to me, this guy was a walking time bomb, and he reckoned it was just a matter of days before he stroked out, had a severe stroke, ended up as a vegetable or dead. So anyway, the patient finally realized that he had a number of problems, and after his heart was fixed, how much better he felt. And he's alive and well. I do his ultrasound once a year. His heart function's improved, and his aortic valves working well, and so forth. And he's on medications to protect his heart against future events. So this is an example of someone who not only dodged a bullet, but he dodged a volley of machine gun fire. So that's the kind of thing I do. So what I'm advocating is that you can use the medical principles of diagnosis, prognostication, and management planning to address the problems of the world. Well, that's what I advocated a few years ago, but it's no longer applicable because of the type of people who actually run our societies. But, well, there's good news, there's bad news, and there's other good news. So the good news is I can solve all the climate problems. I can solve global warming. I have the cure for it. I have the solution to endless energy, and I'll make Papua New Guinea pay for it. All you have to do is vote me in as your absolute leader. I'll be your totalitarian dictator, do everything I say, and I'll solve all your problems. So that's the good news. What's the bad news? Well, everything I just said was a complete lie. But of course you knew that. So what is the truth? And can you handle the truth? What is the other good news? Well, the other good news is there are things that you can do to improve your otherwise bleak outcome, but the future lies in your own hands. You have to seize the future for yourself. You have to be the architects of your own future. You should not look to organizations, to the government, to institutions. They're all useless. So you have to take charge. So if I was to adopt the medical principles to try and figure out what's going on, obviously I'm not a researcher, so I have to depend on the best researchers in these fields to inform myself. And there are specialists in each particular field, and there are the people who have the grand overview of what is likely to happen. And the most famous and the best are probably the limits to growth scientists. So you remember in '72 they published this tome on the limits to growth. MIT scientists, and they used a revolutionary computer model at that time which actually takes into account the interplay of various factors and the various feedbacks in a nonlinear manner. And they looked at 13 different scenarios. Now, of course, they were pilloried by economists then, because economists believe in endless growth on a finite planet. But how did this hold up? So in 2008, Graham Turner, Australian CSIRO scientist working in Melbourne at the time, he plugged in the latest data on what was going on into the World Free Computer model using the latest, number crunches, up-to-date information, and he found that we were actually tracking the standard model of the limits to growth very, very closely. And one of the parameters that was due to fall off the cliff was per capita resource availability around 2015. So this was the most interesting thing was they then tried to input very, very optimistic data into each of these variables. So they looked at what if we could eliminate pollution, solve pollution, or what if we had endless energy, or what if we had endless food. But even using the most optimistic inputs, if you ran the computer models through, everyone ended up in collapse. And the only steady state scenario which did not end up in collapse, which allowed a transition to steady state, was curbing the population, preventing excessive population, combined with all the technical fixes to solve pollution, to have endless energy, to recycle everything, starting from around the 1970s, 1980s. That was the only thing which allowed transition to a stable state, to a sustainable situation. Graham Turner repeated this using updated data, I think it was around 2014. Same sort of result. Whatever we do now, even using the most unreasonably optimistic inputs, it just ends in collapse. But Graham was very, very cautious in his statements, very circumspect, because he says, well, we're just looking broadly at each of these parameters. There might be some unexpected things within, because like climate change was CO2 output as part of the pollution parameter that they were looking at. So they didn't look at each of these in super fine detail, and he said, well, maybe there's something unexpected which we had not taken into consideration, which might not result in such an adverse outcome. But you have to judge people by what they do, not just what they say. So I had the great privilege of actually sitting down and speaking with Graham Turner, who's highly respected by the limits to growth scientists, and that was a couple of years ago. He was still doing occasional work for Melbourne Uni, but he had actually sort of left and set up his homestead in New South Wales, as far south in New South Wales as you can possibly get. And when I spoke with him, he was just a few months away from ensuring that his home electricity was 100% off-grid. So this is the kind of diagram that I use. I call it the 3 horsemen and 1 big fat elephant of the apocalypse. And you can see that there's bidirectional feedback between each of these entities. I actually have omitted 2 components, which are finance and economy and pollution, because I put global warming separately from pollution. And you can actually have that figure with bidirectional feedback with everything if you have a 3-dimensional diagram, but it's too difficult on this flat surface, plus I'll lose my joke about 3 horsemen and elephants. So anyway, this was the diagram I was using, and the thing that drives everything, you can see, is the total human footprint. Population multiplied by individual resource consumption and waste production. And if that has not been addressed, nothing is going to be addressed, and that has not been addressed. Let's look at the limits to growth in a real-world situation. Now, people say, well, the Arab Spring, these are the pundits in the mainstream media. Arab Spring is all about people fighting for democracy and all that. It's total nonsense. I mean, people were living under these dictators for 40 years and they made never made a peep. But why did all these things start happening around 2010, 2011? Syria being the worst case of a collapsed society that we can use as an example. Well, there's lots of things which happened in Syria. Political, proxy wars, fighting over possible gas pipeline corridor and so forth. But I would say that the approximate triggers for the collapse of Syria were the fact that Syria was reaching or had reached the limits to growth in terms of population, in terms of petroleum, in terms of climate change. So if you look at this graph, you can see that now there are people who say, oh, peak oil doesn't exist or peak oil is not important. I'm showing you a real-world example where peak oil was of vital importance. They reached the peak of the petroleum production in 1996. It was abundant petroleum which actually was able to drive this population rise in Syria, because petroleum is basically food. You can use it to produce lots of food. So in 1990, the Syrian population was around 11 million. By 2011, it was 23 million, so almost a doubling of the population driven by petroleum. But after the peak in 1996, their output was declining, while the population and consumption was rising. And when you have the interaction between declining production and increasing consumption, you end up with zero oil availability for export. So their oil income became zero. And their per capita income plunged through the floor. No, social services could not be provided. Not only that, climate change resulted in the worst drought in living memory between 2006 and 2010, resulting in an escalation in the price of grain. So when you don't have proper food, when you don't have affordable food, when you don't have drinking water, when you have lots of people, the situation is just ripe for revolution. So I submit to you that part of what happened in Syria was them reaching limits of growth, and to say that this is not going to happen to us is, I would say, foolish. They are just the beginnings of what's going to happen worldwide, well, in most parts of the world. So you can also look at the curve for Egypt. And so petroleum production was declining and consumption was rising with the rising population where they intersected, and shortly after that, revolution. What happened then with the Egyptian revolution? So Mubarak was cursed out, Mubarak, the puppet of the US for many decades. So they had democracy. What did democracy bring them? Muhammad Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. So you get a Muslim fundamentalist state. Whatever the government, he was not able to deliver the food, the water, the services that they needed because they too had reached limits of growth. So what happened? Military coup. And now they're back to martial law, military, martial kind of government, totalitarian government. That's the only way that they can put a lid on things and enable the systems to run after a fashion by force, by coercion. But Egypt is a lot more fortunate than Syria because they have a more diversified economy. And a huge income earner is the Suez Canal. Plus their water supply is more reliable because of the Nile. That could change. I'm going to now sort of look in greater detail at two major aspects of the limits to growth in detail greater than what the limits to growth scientists had done. Climate change and the precipitous decline of petroleum supply. Petroleum is the keystone energy commodity. Now people say, oh, it's just sort of one form of energy, we have other forms of energy, and depletion petroleum is not going to be that bad. But the thing is, we have made ourselves utterly dependent on petroleum in every aspect. If you think about so-called renewable energy, how are you going to sort of mine the materials to build those windmills, to build those photovoltaic cells, and transport everything, construct factories to do that, distribute all of these things? All depends on petroleum. So so-called renewable energy isn't really that renewable if it depends on a fossil fuel. Without petroleum, our industry is going to collapse. Petroleum can be thought of, you know the saying, a chain is only as strong as the weakest link. Well, petroleum forms many links in the chain of our industrial civilization, and that is going to go. And I'll prove to you how that is going to happen. And it's going to happen sooner than you think. I just need to talk very quickly about climate, because unfortunately, I think you've been fed a lot of disinformation about this. Now, I've had this sort of discussion, I suppose, with Doctors for the Environment Australia. I think their emphasis is completely wrong. They've lost the plot, and it's not their fault because they just take the information from what is considered or what is supposed to be the authority on climate issues in the world, the IPCC. But the IPCC are just talking nonsense. Well, they just watered down a lot of the reality of what's happening. So just quickly, I'll read through. I mean, back in 2010, there was this paper, Asymmetry of Scientific Challenge, which said that new scientific findings were more than 20 times as likely to support the perspective that disruption through anthropogenic global warming may be far worse than the IPCC has suggested. The physical reality is significantly more ominous and has been widely recognized to date. That's 2010. In 2012, another paper saying that scientists may be introducing bias into the predictions for fear of being called alarmist. And now, I don't have time to go through this, but I've actually described exactly why the IPCC's information selection process is deeply flawed, and why their calculations of climate sensitivity are grossly inadequate. They just look at sort of the effect of carbon dioxide alone as a greenhouse gas and the so-called short feedback loops. But the long feedback loops, and the numerous ones, they have not taken into consideration, and in fact, they're not that long, they're happening in the short term as well. But you can find it on the article I wrote. 2014, from this pretty good website, this paper produced by David Spratt and Ian Dunlop, they debunked a number of myths that climate change was not yet dangerous, 2 degrees centigrade is the appropriate focus, policy making, big tipping points unlikely before 2 degrees centigrade, and so on and so on, all basically shown to be wrong. Here's a paper from the Transactions of the Royal Society of Edinburgh saying that land surface temperatures may rise by an average of almost 8 degrees centigrade by 2100. So there are various ways of looking at how future temperatures may rise. We could look at the ice core records, which go back now about 800,000 years. We could look at the paleo record. We could look at thermodynamic calculations. So looking at this, these are very familiar graphs to you, how the temperature and CO2 from the ice core records, they basically overlap each other. You can't put a sort of pin to separate them. If you use an adjusted y-axis scale, the two curves essentially overlap each other. So if you imagine two alien scientists visited Earth 20,000 years ago, when the CO2, atmospheric CO2 was 200 parts per million. And these two scientists placed bets to estimate the future planetary equilibrium temperature for a 70 part per million CO2 rise. So scientist A used IPCC methods, just the CO2 effect and fast feedback loops only, and comes up with just about a 1 degree centigrade rise. Scientist number 2 used the ice core paleo record, seeing how the CO2 and atmospheric temperature follow each other almost exactly, and with 70 part per million CO2 rise, he says 7 degrees centigrade rise. So these two long-lived alien scientists come and visit Earth again in the year 0 AD, and they find that scientist B has been absolutely right. So they come back in the year 0 AD, and there has been from 200 parts per million to 270 parts per million CO2, there has been a 7 degree global average temperature rise, and scientist B was correct. So they now place another simple bet. Will a further 130 part per million CO2 rise lead to more or less than a 4 degree centigrade global average temperature rise? So what do you folks think? 130 parts per million, more or less than just 4 degrees centigrade. Why do I use 4 degrees centigrade? Because beyond 4 degrees centigrade, scientists project that large-scale agriculture will become impossible due to ecological devastation of most land areas. Hence, urban populations will no longer be possible, hence civilization will no longer be possible. However, food production in small isolated climate-favored pockets may still be possible. So here we are, 400 parts per million. There has been a 130 part per million rise from the pre-industrial 270 parts per million to 400 parts per million. And here are the propositions that atmospheric CO2 concentration has been a highly accurate marker and predictor for eventual global average temperature, that the ice core records repeatedly show that, for example, a 70 part per million CO2 rise is associated with a 7 degree centigrade rise, and this cannot be accounted for by solar insolation, carbon dioxide, and fast feedback loops alone, and is due to numerous other positive feedback loops which are dragged along by this rising CO2. Present atmospheric CO2 of 400 parts per million represents a 130 parts per million rise over the Holocene pre-industrial average around 270. Even if current climate sensitivity to CO2 change is half that suggested by the ice core data, which is an unrealistically, ludicrously optimistic assumption, 130 parts per million rise still results in a 6.5 degree eventual global average temperature rise. So even if we could magically cease all further emissions right now and stay at 400 parts per million, it will be impossible to keep global average temperature within 4 degrees centigrade, much less 2 degrees centigrade. So there's another way to look at this. How about the paleo record? What was the temperature of the Earth like the last time atmospheric CO2 was 400 parts per million? So we go back to the Pliocene, about 4 million years ago. It was around 3.5 degrees centigrade higher than our pre-industrial average. So actually, I'm just sort of quick segue, easy way to remember these geologic epochs. Camels often sit down carefully, perhaps their joints creak, perhaps early oiling may prevent premature hobbling. So Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, which actually begins with C, and Paleocene, Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene, and Holocene. So Holocene was the time when we had this interglacial warm period due to a particular configuration of the Milankovitch cycles related to the Earth's orbit around the Sun. But anyway, does that mean that so last time CO2 was 400 parts per million, was around 4 to 5 million years ago in the Pliocene, when estimated global average temperature was 3.5 degrees warmer than Holocene pre-industrial times. Does this mean that if all industrial emissions magically cease now, we can limit temperature to 3.5 degrees? Actually, no, because the solar insulation in the Pliocene may have been less due to a number of factors. It's reasonable to regard Pliocene atmospheric CO2 essentially the same as carbon dioxide equivalent, because methane levels then may have been negligible in a steady state equilibrium. But present day measured CO2 of 400 parts per million is far less than our true CO2 equivalent of almost 500 parts per million, because we are in atmospheric disequilibrium. And we must consider recent exponential release of methane, especially from the Arctic coast. Holocene pre-industrial steady state atmospheric methane was around 720 parts per billion. Satellites now show vast Arctic areas in summer with atmospheric methane almost 2,500 parts per billion. Such methane release has been completely ignored by the IPCC, not to mention numerous other methane sources. There's another way to look at things, and that is by thermodynamic calculations. I think the best guy who did this, and he's been looking at climate issues for more than a decade, and he's been contributing to IPCC as well, is David Wasdell. And it is a bit involved, but I really encourage you to look this up, maybe listen to his presentation 3 or 4 times, because it's fairly dense, but it's of vital importance. And he basically came to the conclusion that based on our existing greenhouse gas emissions, we're headed for something like a 6.2 degrees centigrade rise. So however you look at it, there's just zero hope. There's no chance in hell we can limit things to 2 degrees centigrade. And you can see even the IPCC scientists are really getting desperate. Of the 400 IPCC scenarios that have 50% or better chance of no more than 2 degrees centigrade warming, 344 assumes the successful and large-scale uptake of negative emission technologies, which doesn't exist. Even more worryingly, in all 56 scenarios without negative emissions, global emissions peak around 2010. In plain language, the complete set of IPCC scenarios in 2015 for a 50% or better chance of meeting 2 degrees centigrade target, well, on the basis of either an ability to change the past or the successful and large-scale uptake of negative emission technologies. There's a wide variety of thermodynamic calculations as well about what we may expect, and some go as far as 17 degrees centigrade. But I'm not as pessimistic as Guy McPherson, who says we'll all be extinct by 2026 due to global warming. In fact, I can say to you it is complete nonsense. It is rubbish. And my explanation is, again, in that article I wrote on the Doomsday Dinosaur. If you want, you can look that up. So what are the conclusions about climate? Catastrophic global warming is now baked into the cake, and IPCC delusionists are now resorting to techno-fantasy or time travel fantasy to postulate hypothetical non-disaster scenarios. Even if we can cease all emissions and magically transform to 100% renewable energy now, it will not prevent climate disaster from killing billions of people and causing the end of civilization. This is guaranteed based on existing greenhouse gas levels. Renewable energy transformation will not and cannot occur without total transformation of our existing economic, industrial, and military paradigm, which is violently resistant change. It will not change in an orderly fashion. It can only collapse. Industrial emissions will essentially disappear soon anyway, with the imminent collapse of industrial society due to financial and economic collapse and petroleum supply collapse. The remaining time and energy you have to live the rest of your life are finite, and you must choose the most effective strategies to live as well as you can for as long as you can. Personal action to mitigate against the impending hardships is still possible for some sapient people in 2017, but time is short and you must prioritize and prepare for more urgent issues, essentially financial and energy collapse. Do not look to corporations, governments, or institutions for any help, much less leadership. They are clueless at best, but obstructionist, hostile, and vindictive at worst. Joan Baez famously said, "Action is the antidote to despair, but choose useful, effective action. Do not fluff about pursuing useless activities." Incorporate future climate chaos into your planning. Stop worrying about what you cannot prevent, and do not waste your time trying to save civilization. So that's just climate, but I do need to talk to you about petroleum issues, because this is something which is completely under the radar and yet is in fact more urgent than anything else. So what is conventional oil, what is unconventional oil, what is easy oil, what is difficult oil? What is peak oil? Some people said the idea of peak oil is dead. Well, I can say to you 100% those people are idiots. Peak oil is basically a statement, it's an observation that every conventional oil field will go through a phase of maximum volume output, maximum rate of output, and then inexorably decline to a terminal phase. That's just the behavior of a conventional oil field. What's a conventional oil field? It is one where the oil is stored within porous rock, and there is a dome of impermeable rock called an anticline which caps it. So conventional oil was an incredible windfall for the industrial species. You just have to invest a little bit of energy to just drill a pipe into it, and the oil comes gushing out, and the energy return you get is 1,000 to 1, 500 to 1. It's just a hugely valuable energy commodity. So I would liken conventional oil, a pristine conventional oil field, to maybe a seam of gold. So you have a mine, you've got the seam of gold, you invest this $5 pickaxe, and you whack at that seam, you get a handful of gold, which is worth $500,000. That's conventional oil. High value, high energy oil. What is unconventional oil? It's all the other oil which is difficult to get. And so the ones which are sort of mostly in the news, tar sands, shale oil. So when it comes to conventional oil, the one within porous rock, capped by an anticline, what is the usual sort of way in which the production curve behaves? Well, from initial production to peak of production, it might be 20, 30 years, maybe 35 years if you're lucky. And this is sort of predictable because the way the oil moves through that porous rock might be about 6% per year. So 20, maybe 35 years till peak. And then the reduction also follows sort of the same, 6% per year, but there's more about that later. So what about unconventional? So let's just take these sort of various shale oil plays in the US. How long does it take from production to reach peak? Less than 10 years, maybe 5 years. And how does how does the oil production decline subsequently after it's fallen off peak? In the first year, it falls by about 40%. Second year, maybe 65%. Third year, 85%. So unconventional does not compare in any way, shape, or form with conventional, with the abundance of conventional. Plus, it is a lot more difficult to get at because you have to use a lot of energy to get a little bit in return. So the energy return of the energy invested, EROEI, might be, because if you're sort of putting fracking fluids into those shale deposits, it might be 3 to 1, for example. So I liken the unconventional oil deposits to maybe a riverbank concession, and you're panning for gold, and you get maybe, you spend sort of lots of money on pumps and equipment, and after a month you get maybe a thimble full of gold. That's the kind of return you get in gold compared with a pristine, huge seam of gold in a mine. So high energy return of energy invested oil is what I call easy oil. Low EROEI oil is what I call difficult oil. But the thing is, conventional oil eventually becomes low EROEI oil. How does that happen? Because initially, you have positive pressure within that well, and it just gushes out. But it loses that positive pressure. And as the petroleum quantity diminishes, how are you going to extract that remaining petroleum? You have to pump in stuff, whether it's saline or carbon dioxide or steam, to force the remaining petroleum out. And that requires energy. And as time goes by, the amount of, say, oil compared to the amount of saline that's coming out of your well changes. And you reach a point where you're getting 90% saline, 99% saline, just 1% oil. So your previously high ERO, EI conventional oil field now has become a low ERO, EI difficult oil well. In the same way that if you have a rich gold seam and you've mined it all out, you just have a few flakes left once it's depleted. Anyway, so I'm saying to you here that conventional oil is the very important oil. The easy oil before peak and just after peak is the most important thing. And unconventional oil doesn't account for anything at all because it is a scam. It is like, you know, the riverbank where you actually get less return for all your efforts. So this looks at purely at conventional oil fields, and these are the discoveries which has been diminishing over time, and this is our production and consumption. Famous curve by Colin Campbell, who founded the Association for the Study of Peak Oil. And they famously used a symmetric curve because the originator of peak oil, M. King Hubbert, that's what he used for his mathematical models. It's easiest to use a symmetric curve. I don't have time to go through all this because I've been given the yellow card, but these are really important concepts. But anyway, I'd like to call bullshit on this graph here. So if you just look at this graph at a glance, it looks, wow, over the past few years, there's been a huge amount of unconventional oil. It's going to solve our problems. You know, USA is going to become an energy exporter. But this apparently wonderful graph contains a lot of hidden lies. So if you look at the baseline here is actually 70 million barrels per day of oil production. So the zero baseline is actually way, way down. And basically, there's 8 times more conventional oil that is produced than unconventional oil. So that's bullshit number 1. So bullshit number 2 is unconventional oil has poor ERO-EI. You need 1 unit of energy to produce 3 units of unconventional oil. Where do you get that 1 unit of energy from? From the conventional oil. So let's say there's 9 million barrels per day here of unconventional oil, but it took 3 million barrels of conventional oil to produce that 9 million barrels of unconventional oil. That means you actually need to reduce the top of this conventional oil curve by 3 million barrels per day. So that's bullshit number 2. But bullshit number 3 is basically the vast majority of our conventional oil fields are now past peak. So that means you're reducing your energy return over energy invested when it comes to conventional oils as well. Now we don't know that exact ratio, but you know, if we're sort of only getting 10 to 1, then you actually have to reduce this by another 10%. So this is a dishonest graph in many ways, even though in terms of numbers and facts, technically speaking, it is correct. I'm going to put forward another concept to you, and this is the export land model of Geoffrey Brown, who's a petroleum geologist. So this is the gross, let's just take the gross production curve, which is declining now worldwide. And so what about oil exporting countries? All exporting countries have rising population, like Saudi Arabia is probably like 5 children per family and all that. So their populations are rising, so the consumption rises. So just like Syria, consumption rises, eventually intersects with the declining production curve, and at this point there's no oil available for oil importing countries, and you know, Australia is an oil importing country. So if you actually plot this oil available for import, which is basically the difference between the red and blue line here, you get this line and it goes down to 0 here. So what's the flaw in this? The flaw in this is that this downslope of the Hubbert curve is gross oil production. And you shouldn't consider gross oil production. You need to consider net oil production. What is net oil production? It is the most important concept for you, and the easiest way for you to understand this is what's important to you is your net salary. Your gross salary is not important, no. You might have a certain gross salary, but if your expenses are 50% of that and then there's taxes on top of that, so you only have a certain net salary with which you can do things. So obviously, number one is you want to buy food, pay your rent, utilities, etc. You got extra, you might go on overseas trips. It's your net salary which is important. So if you look at the pristine oil fields when the energy invested is minimal to get a lot of net energy, you can see the 5 fingers of net energy which I got from Dr. Luiano, where you can do a lot of things here. But in a depleting oil well with this sort of nodding donkey rig, you have to put in a lot of energy to extract a little bit of energy, and your net energy hand becomes very small. So what do? Does each of your allocations proportionately reduce? I would say no, because some are more important than others. So food still has to remain a large finger there, right? So perhaps this is a better way to go about things, because we are facing a net decline in energy in the world per capita. And perhaps this is a better way to go. Continued emphasis on food production and distribution, build sustainable disaster-proof communities and renewable energy infrastructure. Is this what's going to happen? Absolutely not. This is what's going to happen. As evidenced by what's happening in USA. They spend $800 billion per year on the military. They want to increase the budget by $54 billion. And to hell with healthcare, to hell with infrastructure, nothing else matters. So this is how the world works. You know, you've got to be honest when a little kid asks the question, why do we have wars? It's because we are ruled by an elite group of psychopaths who own the banks and control the governments and media. They fund both sides of war for profit, and they manufacture the consent of the public through the propaganda of the media. This is the most frightening graph I can ever show anybody, and it was produced by David Murphy, who is one of the doyens of energy return over energy invested. So the traditional Hubbard curve just was symmetrically drawn by emptying Hubbard for mathematical ease. But there are interesting things which happen on this downslope. And I use interesting as a euphemistic term. What I actually mean is devastating or catastrophic or apocalyptic. So what is actually happening? So there's actually very little difference when you have ERO-EI of 100 to 1 and 10 to 1, because you put in a little bit of energy, you get a huge amount of return, and you actually don't need to worry about the energy invested, the proportion of energy invested. Even up here, you don't have to worry about it. It's more or less the same, you know, the net energy versus the gross energy. But on the downslope of the curve, it all changes, and this becomes a cliff. And this is what we need to consider, the net energy available. Now this is with regard to the production, but if you're an oil importing nation, then you also have to consider the export land model, which I mentioned earlier to you. And so if you superimpose the export land model on top of the downslope of the net energy curve, this is what you get. Now, I'm not saying that this is definitely going to happen, because we don't know about the data, but the trajectory is there, and it is undeniable, and this is based on physics. And here's another very important mathematical relationship. Again, it's mathematics, nobody can dispute it. It's a graph showing the relationship between energy return over energy invested, which is on the x-axis, and net energy available. And as I said, it's the net energy which is important to us. And once the ERO-EI goes below around 5 to 1, net energy falls off a cliff. This is where we are headed, inexorably, undeniably. There have been lots of people who have been studying ERO-EI things, and it's prone to all sorts of problems. And so this paper looked at 40 global oil fields, and they mentioned the limitations. They did not include allocation of dry holes or other wasted expenditure in their calculations, which have to be included. The poor availability of data, the very opaque information, the opaque nature of data coming out from the OPEC countries, which are the most prolific exporters. So they found that a lot of what they thought, what they put into this paper may be marginally better than ignorance or reliance on default values. But what I'm saying is, it's actually not a bad thing to rely on default values, because this is what we know. This is how we know that the oil fields behave in this way, and we can, even though we don't have the exact data, we know that the world reached a peak in conventional oil production in 2006, and it's downhill all the way from now, and it's not a gentle slope; it is a cliff. So here's a paper from HSBC. Sort of commissioned some scientists, some energy scientists, to look at the latest data, and so this was published in late 2016. And they said that contrary to commonplace narrative in the industry, even amidst the glut of, it's not a glut. We have a relative oversupply of oil at the moment, which is causing low prices, but that's due to something called demand destruction, which is basically an economic slowdown or recession in the rest of the world. So it's not oversupply, it is under demand, which has resulted in relatively cheap oil. And so European government scientists show that the value of energy produced by oil has declined by half. So, and so that value has declined by half in 15 years. So they too project that the near future is going to be pretty dire. So this is how some people see it, and we are the lucky people at the high dry end of the boat. And so the people who say, oh, it's not our problem, those other people. Or this is another way to see it, that we feel high and dry, so there can't possibly be any problem, and those sinking boat alarmists are really irresponsible. Anyway, that's the end of my presentation, or the end of the world as we know it, as some people would think.